Hello everyone, I'm Sebastian Y, and this is Principles of Macro. In this video, we're going to talk through a few examples of comparative statics in an open economy. We're continuing on with our example from the previous video, so if you haven't seen that one yet, please take a look at it. We're going to look at what happens when the government runs up its deficit in an open economy. Remember that this happens when the government either cuts taxes but doesn't cut spending, or increases spending without increasing taxes. When the deficit increases, the government will have to increase its borrowing in order to make up that deficit. Doing that takes funds out of the loanable funds market, therefore shifting the supply curve to the left. Our original saving curve was S equals negative 200 plus 10,000 R. Let's suppose that the government budget deficit increases by 150, which requires the government to borrow an additional 150 funds in order to cover that. And they're going to have to do that no matter what the interest rate is. And so we're just going to subtract 150 from our saving function. Collecting terms here, we have negative 350 plus 10,000 R. This is still going to have to be equal to I plus NCO, which from the last video we calculated at 1,300 minus 20,000 R. Now we need to solve for R, so I'm going to add 20,000 R to both sides, add 350 to both sides, and then divide both sides by 20,000, which gives us 0.055, 5.5%. Now, plugging that back into our saving function, we have a negative 350 plus 10,000 R, which we now know is 0.055, which is going to be 550 minus 350 equals 200. We can also then plug our interest rate into the net capital outflow, which is 300 minus 10,000 R, which we now know is 0.055. That's going to be 300 minus 550 equals negative 250. With all that figured out, we're going to go back to the graphs and graph these in. First of all, our new interest rate is 0.055, which is about here. And that's going to correspond with a new national saving of 200. Now we need to graph in our shifted supply curve, which will now go through that interest rate. I'm going to draw in some arrows to show this shifted to the left. Now we're going to carry our new interest rate all the way over to our net capital outflow graph. And this is going to be the new equilibrium amount of net capital outflow, which we just calculated was negative 250. All we have left to do is see how this carries over into our foreign currency exchange market by setting our new net capital outflow of negative 250 equal to the net exports function 500 minus 500E, and then solve for E. So I'm going to add 250 to both sides, add 500E to both sides, divide both sides by 500 to get E equals 1.5. Now to add that to the graph, I'm going to draw a new net capital outflow vertical line at minus 250, show that that has shifted to the left, and then mark out our new equilibrium exchange rate, which is 1.5. And then this quantity of dollars right here is negative 250, just like it was up in the NCO graph. What we learned from this is that an increase in the federal budget deficit still has a crowding out effect in the loanable funds market. That is, it shifts the supply curve to the left, increasing interest rates, decreasing investment. But now that we have an open economy, that effect also carries over into net capital outflow. The increased interest rate also decreases net capital outflow. That is to say that more U.S. assets are going to be purchased by foreigners and fewer foreign assets will be purchased by Americans. This decrease in net capital outflow will also carry over into net exports. The trade deficit will increase. American goods will become more expensive relative to foreign goods, shown by the increase in the real interest rate. What this generally shows us is that the federal budget deficit is related to the trade deficit. In this figure, I have graphed the federal budget deficit and net exports both as a percentage of nominal GDP over time. If you stare at this picture for a little bit, you'll see that there is a general relationship shown here. It's not perfect, but there is a correlation. Take a look specifically at the 1980s. This is the era of the Reagan tax cuts, where the deficit increased because taxes went down, but spending did not also go down. The budget deficit increased to over 5% of GDP for the first time in history. You can see net exports also dipping down almost in parallel to the deficit. At other points in history, it doesn't match up quite this perfectly, but this is one example where there is a clear match. Next, let's talk about a couple of other policies that might affect the open economy. For these comparative statics examples, we are going to go through them qualitatively rather than doing more math. The first example I want to talk about is protectionist trade policy. I'm starting with some fresh graphs in equilibrium. You can see from this that this particular economy has a trade deficit because net capital outflow and net exports are negative. Suppose the government wants to protect a domestic industry by enacting some protectionist policies like a tariff or a quota. We need to think now about which of the curves will be affected. A tariff or a quota is going to raise the prices of imported goods. It does not change the incentive to save, so the S curve is unaffected. It does not change the incentive to invest in domestic capital. It also does not affect the incentive to buy foreign or domestic assets. So the investment and NCO are also unaffected. What is going to be affected is the net exports curve. Since quotas and tariffs discourage imports, that's going to shift the net exports curve to the right. Remember, that's because net exports is exports minus imports. So we'll draw a new curve in, shifted to the right. The effect that this will have is that the exchange rate is going to go up. But none of the other outcomes change. This might be a little surprising to hear that a protectionist policy like a quota or a tariff will not actually change the trade balance. You can see from the graph that the trade deficit in this example remained exactly where it is. One way to look at this is that the net capital outflow must equal net exports, and since net capital outflow has not changed in any way, the net exports must also remain the same. But it still might be surprising that even though imports are decreasing, net exports are staying the same. The reason for this is that exports are also going to decrease. The increased real exchange rate makes domestic goods more expensive relative to foreign goods. That's going to decrease the incentive to export. And so even though imports are decreasing, exports will also decrease by the same amount, leaving net exports the same. For our next example, I want to consider a phenomenon called capital flight. Capital flight is when political instability or some other kind of disasters result in people choosing to participate in foreign financial markets instead of domestic ones. There's been many examples of this around the world, including ones precipitated by financial crises in Asia and Latin America, and the political instability in Africa has also caused quite a lot of capital flight from there. Capital flight makes people want to buy foreign assets rather than domestic ones. That is going to shift the net capital outflow curve to the right. This is going to have one other effect, and that is that the demand curve in the loanable funds market will also shift to the right, because the demand there is I plus NCO. So anytime NCO changes, I plus NCO is also going to change in the same way. So we're also going to draw in a shift over there. If we look at our new equilibrium, capital flight is going to increase the interest rate and increase the amount of saving. That's going to carry over to net capital outflow. And that's going to carry on over to the foreign currency exchange market as well. The end result of capital flight in the country that capital is fleeing from is that interest rates go up, saving goes up, net capital outflow goes up, and therefore net exports also go up. We can also consider how this is going to affect countries into which capital is fleeing. And so if capital is fleeing out of Latin America and into the United States, in the United States, all of the changes we talked about previously will be in reverse. So in the United States, capital flight will decrease net capital outflow, because foreigners are now buying U.S. assets, and at the same time, the demand curve in loanable funds will also shift to the left. If we look at the effect of this, this is going to decrease the interest rate. It's going to decrease saving. And now if we carry the new interest rate all the way over to the net capital outflow graph, we can see that net capital outflow is decreasing. And then if we draw in a new supply curve in the foreign currency exchange market, we can see that the trade balance is decreasing and the real exchange rate is going to increase. Basically, everything will happen in the opposite direction as what's happening in the country that capital is fleeing from. That wraps up our discussion of the theory of the open economy. Thanks for watching.